Hey, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Eric Nelson, and I'm going to go ahead and start the August 18th short-term rental stakeholder meeting. Today, we're meeting with the neighborhood, individuals within the neighborhoods who are potentially affected by short-term rentals. And first off, I want to introduce the group that's here today. So we have on the call today, Vice Chair Roy Donor, Brenda God, I always trip up on your name. I'm so sorry. Wisneski, Senior Planner John Chiampa, City Attorney Patrick Munoz, Allison Peterson's on here, who, and I don't see Jeff Rosser, who have joined us the last couple of days. I don't know if he's going to be able to make it today. And then we'll do introductions of the stakeholder when we get into the Q&A to keep things moving. Today we wanted to go over a quick update as to what has occurred since the last stakeholder meetings, talk about the process that we're looking at now for evaluating short-term regulations, go over the current STR statistics, and then individually talk to each and every one of you about your recommendations and your thoughts on a series of questions that we'll be asking about halfway through this presentation, followed at the end with any Q&A or follow-up conversations that the stakeholders feel like are necessary. So with that, if you recall, John, if you could, next slide, we embarked on a process of evaluating short-term rentals following a city council meeting in July of 2020. During that meeting, city council gave us several key direction points, which you can see on the screen here. One of which, an important one, is to maintain the neighborhood character and discourage absentee and corporate investment, to protect against nuisances, and to balance the rights and responsibilities of homeowners and honor our HOA regulations at the same time. And that was direction given to the Planning Commission, which was ultimately, we formed this subcommittee, which is a combination of city staff, myself, and Vice Chair Donor. And we are now in phase two. Phase one was a discussion and an ultimate recommendation to the City Council on updated regulations to address mainly number two on this list here. And the next phase of this is to really talk about what short-term rentals could look like, what they should look like, and what the Planning Commission will ultimately end up doing or recommending to the City Council. Will be based on a number of different things, including the conversations we're having today, the conversations we've had with multiple stakeholders, and then the continued community outreach. And we'll talk about the ongoing process and what's planned in the future. John, can you flip the slide? So as you recall, we did recommend to the City Council several changes to the existing municipal code regulations. Most notably, we added some annual noticing requirements, which really put the onus on the neighbor or on the owner to ensure that the neighbors know who to call and when to call if there's an issue, along with some other minor changes, again, all in preparation for the next phase, which we are in today. John, can next slide. And with that, we wanted to take a few minutes. I'm going to turn this over to City Attorney Patrick Munoz, talk a little bit about existing short-term rentals and some legal case that just came down in Santa Barbara. And Pat, I'll let you take it from there.
Sure, thank you, Chair Nelson. The Santa Barbara decision is a lengthy reported, published, I should say, Court of Appeal opinion. I'm not going to try and explain the entire case, but I think that for our purposes, what's really important to bear in mind from the case is that the Coastal Commission takes the position that any property that within our local coastal program, which is permitted to be used as a residential property, can by right have a short-term rental. The court didn't go quite so far as to agree with them, but it is very clear that that's what the Coastal Commission's position is, which is consistent with the position they took in a case up in the Pismo Beach area, Oxnard area, I should say, involving homeowners association. And their view of the world is that anybody who wants to run a short-term rental out of their house can do so. And the only limitation on that is if a city has a regulatory scheme for short-term rentals that has been approved by the Coastal Commission. As I mentioned, the Court of Appeal didn't go so far as to agree with this underlying concept that anybody who wants to run a short-term rental can do so as a matter of right. But the Court of Appeal did say that regulation of short-term rentals is exclusively within the purview of the Coastal Commission. And so any regulations have to go through Coastal. The facts of that case were relatively similar to the facts that we've been dealing with in Dana Point. And so I guess the bottom line relevance of all this is that we believe that there is a need to get some regulations in place and approved so that whether we would agree with it or not, we don't want to be faced with a situation where people are making the argument that they can rent their house on a short-term basis and there's nothing the city can do about it because the city has not gone through Coastal to have regulations approved that would otherwise restrict their ability to do, in essence, whatever they want from a short-term rental standpoint.
Great, thanks, Patrick. John, move that slide forward. So with that in mind, and with the history, we in talking about our framework and how do we move to the next step. And what we've done is we've looked at the surveys, we've looked at the city council direction, the guidance that we've received from the Coastal Commission, as well as code enforcement data, and then the previous input that we received through our outreach efforts and through our stakeholder meetings has sort of given us some framework to start to work from. Next slide, John. And that framework really starts with trying to define what short-term rentals look like and really put some definitions to them, because without those, anything under 30 days would be a short-term rental. So, John, do you want to walk through these and then also talk a little about the data that we have as well related to these?
Sure, thanks, Eric. So the city's looked at the different types of short-term rentals that are out there and have broken it down into three groups. The first is homestays. So this is where the property owner is residing in their primary residence, and they would operate a short-term rental either by renting a room or two out of their home, or in the case if the property is a multifamily structure like a duplex or a triplex, they would live in one of the units on the property and would be renting out one of the other units as a short-term rental. So they'd be on site while all of this is happening. Then the other one is a primary residence short-term rental. So this is where it is the owner's primary residence. They live there more than half of the year, and it is rented when they are not residing at the property. So if they travel in the summer or the winter and they were looking for some additional income, they would be renting the property during that time as a short-term rental, so less than 30 days at a time. Then last is the non-primary residence, which is what's seen as the typical short-term rental, where the property owner does not reside at the residence and it is operating as a short-term renter or short-term rental throughout the year. So with that, I'm going to go through a little bit of data of short-term rentals that we've collected to aid us in the process of reviewing short-term rentals for phase 2. So with that, we've developed this map of the city, and there's a number of different data layers that are on here. What we have is the properties throughout the city that are operating as short-term rentals are plotted here in the individual dots. We also have the coastal zone plotted on the map, which is that faint blue line that meanders through the city. And then we've also broken down the different zones in the city where the short-term rentals are located, which are between single family, which is in yellow, and multifamily residential, which is in orange. Now, also another zone that is a potential for short-term rentals under consideration as part of this phase 2 is the mixed-use zones. So those are identified in brown. We've also broken down the different locations in the community where short-term rentals are located into the voting districts. So as you can see on the pie chart here, we've got District 1, which is the northern portion of the city, which has 30 short-term rentals, primarily located within the Corniche community. Then in Districts 2, we only have 4 short-term rentals. District 3, we have 5. And then when you get into District 4, which is the Lantern District, it jumps up to 42 short-term rentals. And then in District 5, we've divided that into 2 groups. The first being Capo Beach, which has 20, and then the Beach Road community, which has 34. Some of the other data information that we've collected is to understand how many of these are in the coastal zone versus out of the coastal zone, as well as by zone type. So by zone type, we have 93 that are in the multifamily residential zone, which again is in orange, and then 42 are in the single family residential zone, which is in the yellow colored areas. 71 are in the coastal zone and 64 are out of the coastal zone. And then we've also broken down the number of short-term rentals by type. Overwhelming majority are of the non-primary residents, which is 123. Then we have 6 primary residents and 6 homestay short-term rentals. So that's just a quick summary of some of the data that we've collected as far as where all of the existing permits are. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Eric to go over some of the framework as well as some questions to you regarding new short-term rentals.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. So this is the part, the interactive part, and we really want to get as much feedback as we can. We do have a limited amount of time, so I'm going to let anybody who wants to speak, obviously, speak, and we're not going to call on you, just unmute yourself. And one thing we ask is for everybody to be respectful and make sure everybody has an opportunity to talk. Also, if you could do us a favor, the first time you speak, give us your name, your full name, and where you live for the record. We're trying to keep good notes of who's speaking and what they're sharing. So with that, I'm gonna go ahead and ask this first question, and it's really boils down to what types of short-term rentals should be permitted, and should they be permitted in each zone? Should they not be permitted at all? I mean, really, we want to get some feedback. We put on some of these slides a reference to what other cities are doing, just as a way to see what other people, coastal towns and other towns that are dealing with short-term rentals are doing. And as you can see in Laguna Beach, they allow short-term rentals in the mixed use and commercial zones and homestays throughout. And they also have some grandfathered units. But I'd love to hear from our stakeholders. What are your thoughts on homestays, primary, non-primary, and whether or not they should be permitted in what zones? And please don't be shy. Buck, I see your name on here. You're generally willing to share.
Okay.
My preference would be something exactly like Laguna Beach. Short-term rentals in mixed use and commercial, and homestays in other residential districts.
Okay. That was Buck Hill, right?
Yes, Buck Hill, sorry.
Thank you.
And I'm here, Betty Hill. I'm here also, and would kind of agree with that. Although even the homestays are going to be hard to regulate. So even those, I think, would have to have some limitations.
And we will talk a little bit about, what those look like in some of our questions too. So we have, some deeper dive questions here to go over as well. I did see Kim, you unmuted.
Yes, I'm unmuted. So thank you, Kim Tarantino in Capistrano Beach. So I have two comments or questions. So one is, I'm looking at that recent case, and there is a reference saying that even if not explicitly prohibited, STVRs are not allowed in residential zones if they are subject to permissive zoning doctrines, which they don't, the zoning doctrine does not specify that these are allowed. So I know that we are in that circumstance where we have permissive zoning. So I don't understand how it is that you can bypass the zoning and allow short-term rentals. So that would be my first question. My second question, this is one I've brought up at some of the city council meetings. You constantly are showing numbers for the short-term rentals, but when I go onto AirDNA, I am seeing numbers that show approximately 340 or 350 houses, short-term rentals available in both 92624 and 92629. And I know that one comment was, well, the description is you get neighboring communities, people put Dana Point in the description, so it comes under the Dana Point umbrella. So I've contacted AirDNA. They said, no, they're accurate to within 300 meters. Okay, so that explanation doesn't make sense. I mean, as far as it coming under the umbrella just because they threw the word Dana Point in their description. And then the other one was, well, those are all 30-day rentals. Well, I went on those sites and it was interesting because yes, some of them do, not all of them, some of them do list 30 days, but when you read the patron comments, this is great for a 3-day weekend, loved our week here. So clearly we are missing out on TOT from people who are saying they're 30-day rentals and they're not. And the other is, again, I think we have way more than 130 something short-term rentals that are being operated. So if we could have both the question, the permissive zoning issue, and then the numbers and AirDNA, and I'm happy to send you that information if you want to look at it. It clearly shows every house where located within 300 meters or 300 feet of where they're actually located, because for privacy issues, of course, they don't want to be that specific unless you engage with the owner.
Kim, I would appreciate seeing that data because we are paying host compliance to scrub the internet to find these unpermitted STRs. So if you have data that we can share with them to ensure that they're being accurate, then I would appreciate seeing it. I think you have my email address.
I'll send it over today.
Appreciate it. And the first question, Patrick, maybe he can help answer that.
All right, trying to get myself off of mute. So the Coastal Commission just basically takes the position that there is no such thing as permissive zoning when it comes to this issue, in the sense that, as far as they are concerned, a residential use by right allows you to have a short-term rental. So the way permissive zoning works is that anything that is not permitted is prohibited. And what the Coastal Commission is saying is that when they approved our local coastal program, when they approved a residential use, that was in essence approving any residential use, which would include a short-term rental. So, we've always disagreed with the Coastal Commission on that, by the way. It has always been our position that short-term rentals are more of a commercial use, more akin to a hotel, and that they are not permitted under our zoning. But I'm just reporting to you what the Coastal Commission's view of the world is.
My understanding is that Coastal Commission prefers homestays because they want to make it accessible. If you look at Santa Monica, the average daily rate is about $250 a night. In Capo Beach, it's closer to $450, which is not accessible. The point of Coastal Commission is providing access to the coast. I don't think $450 a night is providing a lot of access to a number of families, even if it's a 5-bedroom place. I mean, it's still $450 a night, and that's an average rate.
Well, I'm not advocating one way or another here, and I certainly have more than one well-documented disagreement with the Coastal Commission. But I will tell you what they will say is that you are wrong, and that $450 a night is a wonderful price because I can put, my husband, wife, and 4 children in a home where we have access to the coast and we can cook for ourselves and it's affordable. Whereas if I go to the St. Regis, it's $1,000 a night and I need 3 rooms, and then I have to buy food on top of that. And I'm making up those numbers, obviously, but that's kind of their view of the world. Right, wrong, or otherwise, that's just sort of how they see the world. And I have had a number of conversations with Coastal Commission, and they have never once said to me that they prefer homestays. And in fact, in the conversations that I've had as recently as this Monday, they seem to say, well, if you want to have homestays, that's great. We like those, but we're really interested in the more kind of traditional short-term rentals as an option that's out there for people. So, I mean, that's what their legal counsel told me in the conversation that I had. And I will admit, I didn't say, do you prefer homestays? I mean, that was not the conversation, but it was pretty clear from the conversation that, to me, that their preference are the more traditional short-term rentals. And I'll, reference that to Brenda. You might be able to answer that question or respond to that issue maybe better than I can, because you've had much more interaction with Coastal than I have, but that was certainly my takeaway.
The bottom line is the Coastal Commission is looking for variety, and that's why they are open to homestays, but they want to ensure that there's a range of options available to the public.
Right. Well, one thing I'd like to do, and maybe I can send it to you, Patrick, is some information I found when I was doing some research on California Coastal and the dollar amounts, because I think based on what I found, I would disagree with you on your comment that they say, hey, $450 is not bad. They have a formula they stick to, and I can send that to you. I'd be curious to see what your take is on that.
Sure, I'd be happy to look at anything you have.
I agree with you, Kim. I don't think they're worried about people who have a choice between a St. Regis or a $450 a night. They're looking for more very moderate type people who don't have that kind of money and are looking to try and be close to the beach. Also, I'd like to make one comment about the listings. If Airbnb were required to post or have the permit number on the listing, I think that might eliminate a lot of what we're talking about, people who advertise without getting a permit. And many cities do require Airbnb not only to have the permit, but also collect the TOT and submit it to the city. I think Dana Point should require that, frankly. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And I believe we do have a new requirement that every image, as well as the description, and it does require that they put their permit number on it, so we can track it. If I'm not mistaken, that was one of the things that that we implemented in this last phase.
That's correct.
Okay, so let's go to the next slide.
I'm sorry, but does Airbnb, are they required to collect the TOT and submit it to the city?
The city is looking into that. We don't currently utilize them for collecting TOT, but it's something we're looking into.
Well, it needs to be done ahead of approving this, because then the city has no leverage. If you do it now, then Airbnb would be more inclined to agree. And other cities have been required to do that. And I think it's really important to do it before anything is passed by Dana Point. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So the next question is, with the knowledge that there are going to be some short-term rentals, how many and where and what is certainly up for discussion. We do have 135 current ones, but as we look at this, the thought is, should we establish a cap that ensures that we have no more than a certain amount? And then as we look at that, should that cap, if we do implement that, be by a zoning district, by a citywide cap, by voting district, census block, coastal versus non-coastal? I mean, we could really, break it into a lot of different pieces, but we wanted to get some input on that specific question on what your thoughts would be relative to permit caps.
I mean, I absolutely agree that there should be a cap by district. Although realistically in districts, I think 1 and probably 2 and 3, from a practical standpoint, you're not going to have many because of so many HOAs, and the HOAs mostly ban short-term rentals.
Do you think there should be a cap on homestays or primary stays?
I don't think on homestays, because homestays provide the supervision that the lack of creates a problem, and which is what most people are not happy about.
But Kim, if you allow homestays, they're hard to regulate. That's the problem Santa Monica had when they had to go back in and try and put more regulations on. People will say, well, we have a homestay, but then they will just advertise and do whatever they want. So that would be my problem with unlimited homestays.
Okay.
Do you have any initial reaction to what an appropriate cap would be?
I would say you've got to figure out exactly how many you have now. So Brenda, I will send you the information that I'm getting from AirDNA, because right now I think if you really do have the 350 or so, I mean, what is an appropriate amount? I'm not quite sure how you even define that. And especially when they get accumulated by area. So if you say there's 100 in District 5, but they're all down Beach Road, I'm sure the Beach Road people would not be happy about that.
Great, thank you. Anybody else on that one, on that particular question?
Yes, I do believe that this is Laura. I do believe there should be a cap. And I don't know necessarily how it should be broken up exactly. I think all categories should be available for short-term rentals and not just one. And then I think that maybe it's what the Coastal Commission kind of wants us to do that will get passed through that system. So if they say you need, 200 short-term rentals that we'll approve and will be in agreement with, I would think it would be the input on what they're basing the requirements on.
Okay, and Laura, just so for the record, what's your full name and residence where you live?
Laura Lanier in Dana Point.
All right, thank you. Okay, great feedback on that. John, could you advance the slides? So one of the other questions that continues to pop up with the existing permits, and as we look at how do we do this in the future, is what do we do with existing permits? If, and again, we're trying to forecast in the future if we do have permits, because I certainly don't want to telegraph that we've made up. I certainly haven't made up my mind. I think it's the writing's on the wall that Coastal is going to require some, and so given that, what do we do with those that do have permits and then they ultimately sell their unit or their home? Should those permits transfer? What would your thoughts be on whether any or all of those different types of permits should have the transferability provisions? Or should they just be part of the cap and you have to go back and re-permit them, so to speak?
I would think they should not be, this is Laura, I don't think they should be transferable. I think each person should apply and should go through the inspection and regulatories to ensure that everyone's informed of what's required. So I don't think necessarily they should transfer.
Okay, thanks, Laura. Anybody else on that one? Okay, next slide, John. So one of the things we're also talking about is, should we, as we think through this, should we start discussing nights or maximum nights, and again, or not again, but more specifically related to primary and home stays. I think the consensus has been today from the other stakeholders that non-primary should not have maximums because they're in essence short-term rentals year-round. But there has been a discussion about including primary residents, which would be a case where a homeowner may want to go out of town, for 30 days or 90 days or for some period of time and have the ability to rent their home out as a short-term rental, but with maximum or with a cap on how often and how many, visitors they could have. As a point of reference, if you see the slide here, San Francisco does allow that with a 90-night maximum. Pismo Beach has a 182-night maximum for primaries and no limit on homestays. And then Palm Springs does it by contract. So what they allow you to do is have 36 individual contracts over a year period. And wanted to get your feedback on whether we should entertain that, and if you had an idea on what that would be, how many maximum nights we should be even looking at, if you thought that was something we should do.
I think that there should be a minimum number of nights. I think right now, what is it, or the proposed is 2 nights?
It's 2, yes.
Okay, because I've read where some groups or some cities have said, when you only have it 2 nights, you're more susceptible to having the place rented for a party or whatever it might be. So usually a couple of nights being required. So
you see minimum as the issue, not maximum, if I hear you correctly.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking, because I think a maximum, how is that any different if someone wants to rent their place out for 90 days? That's no different than a long-term rental, and everyone is okay with that, I think.
One of the problems with the number of nights, the maximum nights, is you're really talking about how many weekends they could use. So you could rent it every weekend for 2 nights. Every weekend would be covered. That poor neighborhood would have every weekend covered, and they still might not, exceed the maximum nights allowed. So that's kind of the problem when it's sort of open-ended like that. How will it really impact the neighborhood? And I think what these are trying to do is minimize the impact on the neighborhood and the nuisances and so forth. And these open-ended maximums just don't, to me, give enough protection. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I would agree.
Go ahead.
I would agree that a minimum number should be required if you, in the rules and regulations, if you state a minimum number of nights for one stay.
And I think more than 2 nights. Would you agree?
I agree. More than 2.
What about a minimum number of weekends? If we're going to go for that's when people are going to be there. So if you had maybe a minimum number of weekends, or with 2 nights per weekend or whatever, you might get something that would be beneficial to neighborhoods.
Can you be more specific what you mean by that? I just want to understand the context.
Well, I'd have to really think about what it would really mean for a family or a neighborhood to have every weekend or all these weekends when you're really home and trying to enjoy your home and your family. If every time you turn around, you've got a new short-term renter there on the weekends. So I don't know.
So Betty, are you saying that you think there should be a maximum number of weekends that someone could rent their home out for? Okay, you said minimum, so I just wanted to clarify.
I'm sorry, maximum. Yeah, let's say you have a maximum number of 25 weekends instead of a maximum number of days. Just say, hey, we just want to make sure that some of those weekends are not being impacted by STRs. I mean, it's just, I mean, just off the top of my head, it's kind of brainstorming of how something a maximum could really work to do what we wanted to do, which is to make these neighborhoods, have less nuisances and more enjoyable for families who are there full time.
Great. Yeah, that makes sense. I understand what you're saying now. I appreciate the follow-up on that. Anybody else on this topic?
Not on this topic. Can I go back to just one comment on the caps? San Diego
Sure.
made a recent change, gosh, maybe a couple of months ago. And what they did is they took it by, I think that they're districted as well. So it's a percentage that's applied to the population. The exception was Mission Beach, which is very similar to our Beach Road situation. And because the nature of that environment was there were a lot of rentals all the time, they were a bit more lenient on the number of short-term rentals that could be in that area. So that might be a way to approach a cap.
Okay, and so just so I understand, what you're saying is a percentage of the population, and then maybe a carve out or an exception for a beach road type condition or a Corniche situation. We have a lot of permits all in one spot.
Right. I mean, I don't know.
Okay.
If Corniche is the area where people go, yeah, we're cool with this because it's always been this way. Beach Road, I think, is that way. I don't know about Corniche. And I can send you that information because that was stuff that was just, well, when I was looking at it, it had been approved like the day before. But I can send you that information because they clearly thought this out and tried to make it as understandable as possible.
Yeah, please share anything you've got. It'd be great. It really will help us as we continue to evaluate things.
Can I ask another question that may be on topic and may not be? What about this issue of
Sure.
rental arbitrage?
Okay.
So how is the code enforcement going to deal with that?
Yeah, so if we can hold on that particular question to the
sure.
end, just because I don't want to get too far off topic. We have a couple slides we still need to get through, and then
Yeah.
with the remaining time, I think will be a great question for Jeff Ross, who I think was able to join. He can address that one. So I want to move to the next slide here real
Before we
quickly.
move to the next, can I just jump in, please?
Yes, please. Just give us your name and your where you live, please.
Okay, Felicia Lerner, and I live on Beach Road. So, Kim, I didn't quite understand what you were saying about what has always been on Beach Road, and I'm not sure what the reference you were making to. So I can't really answer to that because I didn't really understand or hear you correctly. I just want to add that it is, in my opinion, absolutely imperative that we increase the minimum stay from 2 days. We cannot have a 2-day minimum STR. It's a nightmare, an absolute nightmare, especially living on Beach Road. The houses are hotels with absolutely zero supervision. And it's just, I mean, code enforcement doesn't work, the police don't respond. I mean, I can just go on and on, having renters on either side of me. So as much information as you'd like about that, I'm happy to share.
Great. And when you say it should be more than 2, do you have a number in mind?
Yeah, I think it should be a minimum, like 10 days, 10 days or more.
I'm sorry, a minimum what? Can you say it again?
10 days or longer.
Did you say 10?
Correct, 10.
Okay, great, thank you.
Can I ask Felicia a question?
Sure.
Felicia, I think the typical rentals for Beach Road back in the day was 7, like people would come in on Sunday and leave on Saturday. Did you live on Beach Road when that was more the standard?
Yes, I've been on Beach Road about 20 odd years. But yes, it was. And that also, I mean, that was better than the 2 days. But you've also got to remember that also created a problem because of our entrance. Our entrance is really, we would be backing up onto PCH because we've got a guardhouse and people have to be checked in, and then you've got to turn around of the cleaning people, and it creates way too much traffic for our road. If there's an emergency on our street, there's a problem. Nobody can get in. No emergency vehicle can get in or out. I mean, actually, as far as I'm concerned, Beach Road shouldn't be having any STR because our road can't accommodate it. I mean, it's a huge problem. You know, you're allowing extra people onto the street, you know, renters, and so now it's no longer, you know, 2 cars. You now allow 4 cars, and then they have visitors, and now the kids on the street, and God forbid somebody has a heart attack or has an accident, and you suddenly got paramedics and firemen trying to get down the street. Can't access it. It's impossible. So it's a big problem. Nobody seems to take that into account. If there's a fire on the street, you know what's going to happen?
Okay, great, thank you. So I want to move on to the next slide, which, John, I think you've already done that. And really, you know, again, going back into, you know, looking at categorizing and locations, you know, where are they appropriate? And you know, one of the things we've heard from the community is that there's a concern that if these are allowed in the multifamily zones, that they have the potential to gobble up really important rental stock, which is already hard to find. And wanted to get some feedback on thoughts of, you know, where do these belong? Should we consider single family zoning as well as multifamily zoning as we try to evaluate these things? And, you know, multifamily zoning could take on a couple of different forms, whether it's duplex or triplex, but wanting to get some input on that as well.
Well, I've thought about this a lot over the years, and I really feel that these multi-unit places could be inclined to become mini hotels. I mean, I can see where an owner of one would see an advantage to turning the whole thing over into a short-term rentals, like a mini apartment. So I think for the protection of our low-income renters, and we've got over 40% of renters in our city, I think it's really important that some protection is made for those kinds of properties.
Thank you, Betty. So is your thought on that, you know, that we limit, so to the extent that we do allow them, it would be a small fraction of what's, you know, let's say there's a 10-unit building, maybe one of those units could potentially be short-term, but consider it as a limiting factor?
Well, years ago, I suggested when it first was on thinking about STRs, I suggested 25%. You know, 1 out of 25% of these multi-unit buildings, but I don't know if that would even, how that would equate. Buck thinks that's too much, so I don't know.
Yeah, I do know that there's some rules, and I don't know specifically what they're, but you exceed a certain number in any building and it's automatic. It's then considered a hotel, which would obviously not be allowed in multifamily zoning. So I know there's some legal framework there, but you know, we really want to focus in on ensuring that we do protect our rental stock, because that is a concern as housing continues to go up, you know, in price, and you know, rental units are very hard to find these days.
And I would agree. I would think it would be a limited number, because if they are renting long-term, then the people in that tight facility and quarters would kind of have the nuisance of people flipping all the time. If they have kids, maybe it's a safety issue in such a small space. So a certain percentage for sure.
Okay, thank you. Jonathan, can you advance the slide?
Also, I think you need to also be worried about being, discriminating against some of our minority groups who may make a larger percentage of people who rent these places. So you want to make sure that you're not, targeting, or it looks like you're targeting minorities.
Great, thank you. So that gets us to the end here. We do have a Q&As next, but real quickly, Jonathan's going to just do a quick discussion on what the next steps are, and then we'll go to Q&A and closing comments.
So we just want to give you an update as things progress. So with that, At every planning commission meeting, one of the subcommittee members will provide an update to the planning commission. So those meetings are available to the public, and you can view them online to stay abreast of any of the developments. We will be having future public meetings. However, those dates will be determined in the future. All of you are on our interested parties list, so you'll be emailed of those as they become available. As well as the city has a public outreach program to ensure that we're getting the word out. And then speaking of getting the word out, the city will be sending out shortly a citywide flyer that will go to all of the properties within the city, informing them of the progress, as well as recommending them, if they're interested, to get on the city's interested parties list to begin to be informed of these meetings. So and then in addition, there is a possibility for additional stakeholder meetings. So we may be reaching out to you in the future to get your input on some additional items.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. So this is the part, and I know that Kim, you had asked a question, and Jeff, hopefully you remember what that question was and can address it around rental arbitrage. And if you could jump on real quickly and answer that question, that'd be great. Looks like you unmuted, Jeff, but we can't hear you.
I did unmute, but I hadn't started talking
there
yet.
You are.
Kim, can you go ahead and give me an example of what you're speaking of?
Yes, so there are apartments that are available to rent on a year lease, and I rent them, and the rent is $3,000 a month. And I figure that this works out really well because I can list that apartment on Airbnb and make $5,000. So I'm going to make $2,000 profit. And I may or may not disclose this information to the lessor, the lessor, yeah, because I'm the lessee. And so what I'm wondering is, how would you even begin to monitor something like that? I mean, because I don't know if you were in the conversation earlier, but this is the same issue I brought up multiple times, and that is AirDNA is showing far more numbers of short-term rentals in 92624 and 29 than is on the list of permitted. So it seems as though there's not a great system in place to monitor. And I know you say you're using Granitus, or what used to be referred to as, I forget what the other enforcement, whatever that entity was. But, I think rental arbitrage is very likely in some of these areas. As long as the rents aren't $5,000 a month, and then you can only make $5,000 a month. But if there's enough of a margin there, now you've got an additional, especially since now we have so many multifamily units being built. So I'm just wondering, I'm curious how that would be approached.
Well, it would be approached just like any unpermitted short-term rental would be. We have had instances of that in the past 2 or 3 times, especially when we first started the program. And the best thing is basically to send that notice of violation to not only the property but the property owner as well. And once the property owner is made aware, oftentimes they weren't aware. Once they're made aware, they put a stop to it pretty quickly.
Okay. Can I also bring up one other thing, and this is directed toward Patrick? And I'm wondering, Patrick, if you could just present a summary of the case, the crack case versus City of Santa Barbara, because I'm looking at a summary of it, and it looks to me like it's based on technicalities. It's not so much Coastal Commission saying, hey, you need to have short-term rentals. It's more about how Santa Barbara was saying, oh no, this is not a development, because Coastal Commission defines development as any change within the coastal zone. And apparently they did have a change, but they didn't get the permit to do that. And then also, I think there was a definition or a question about using the term tech. So when I'm reading this, I'm thinking this case may not mean that short-term rentals have to be allowed in the coastal zone. So if you could just provide some kind of.
I'm happy to give you the case and you can read it yourself instead of the summary if you like.
I have access, but I'm not getting the same information. I'm not reading the same information out of it that you were explaining. Because again, my interpretation of what you said was that coastal is demanding that short-term rentals be allowed in the coastal zone.
So coastal's, the position that the Coastal Commission took, by the way, we represented as an amicus in this case. Yeah, so, you know, I don't want you to, don't misinterpret what I'm saying with my opinion. I'm just telling you what, you know, what's out there. In the briefs, which we pulled up, Coastal Commission takes the position that I was explaining, that any short-term rental, any residential use by right can have a short-term rental use. As I mentioned, the court did not adopt that position. They didn't go that far, but that is Coastal Commission's view of the world.
And also it's being appealed, my understanding is.
Sorry, say it again?
The case, I believe, is appealed.
It's on appeal. It's not appeal. It's called, they submitted a petition for review, which is how you go to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court does not have to take petitions for review. You know, in terms of the cases that get accepted by the Supreme Court, you know, if I had to handicap it, I would say it's unlikely that the court will review this case, but it could. You know, I'm just, you know, making an educated guess on that. So, and certainly if review is granted, then it's no longer good law, and we have to wait and see what the Supreme Court says.
Okay, but you are saying that the court did not agree, didn't go as far as agreeing with the argument in the case.
It's, what you said is very technical, okay? I don't know if the court agreed with it or not, but the court did not adopt that argument as part of its ultimate findings. So the concern to us is that that's what Coastal Commission's position is. And so, you know, we're looking down the barrel of a very aggressive regulatory body. And this is, you know, what they think the law ought to be. They're very willing to fight cases on these lines. And so, you know, we're just pointing that out as information that this is where Coastal Commission thinks the world is. If, you know, the worst case scenario for the city of Dana Point is that some operator of a short-term rental takes this case and they insist that they're allowed to operate before we have any rules in effect. So they just start operating. Then they take this case and they use it to support the idea that they're allowed to operate by right, and that if we come up with any rules, that the rules that we adopt are new rules that don't apply to them, that they are what is known as a legal non-conforming use. So since our rules, like our TOT, have not been approved by Coastal, they could say we can operate and we don't have to pay TOT. And we can operate and we don't have to pay attention to any of the good neighbor rules, I'll call them loosely, that are out there in the city's ordinances until they've been approved by Coastal. And then once Coastal approves them, they say, we still don't have to comply with those rules because we're a legal non-conforming use. So we still don't have to pay TOT, and we still don't have to pay or pay attention rather to any of the, you know, the regulatory rules that exist. If someone were to push that argument and if a court were to adopt it, that's obviously a pretty bad result for the city, especially if you then look at anybody who is out there currently operating. So we have 135, give or take, operators we know of. If they all said, well, gee, if that's the law, not only are we going to start ignoring our permits and not paying TOT, but we're going to talk about suing the city to get all our money back. And then if it's true, and I don't know one way or another, but if it's true, there's another 150 of them out there that, you know, Kim, you keep referencing. If they're out there, they're all going to say, yeah, we can keep operating too, and we don't have to follow the law. And after a law is adopted, we still don't have to follow it because we're a legal non-conforming use. So,
but that wouldn't. But that really wouldn't be an issue because everyone that's received a permit, those permits say, hey, this is temporary. You might lose the permit.
Yeah, what we say on those permits that this is all subject to coastal approval. And if I'm one of those people, and if someone successfully made this case that I'm just outlined, I go, well, wait a second. Okay, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. You know, you were saying it was all subject to coastal, and we agree. And since you didn't have proper coastal approval, we were operating, you know, trying to be good neighbors, operating in good faith, trying to follow your rules, but your rules were illegal, and we were operating lawfully and just voluntarily submitting to you. And so we're going to continue to operate. You know, I'm not telling you that this is going to happen. I'm just painting for you what the worst case scenario is. And it's part of the reason that this case gives us a lot of concern. We certainly would rather be in a position as a city where we have come up with a regulatory scheme that coastal has approved, that we can all live with. Whether whether it's perfect or not, you know, is a different question. But I'd much rather be in a position where we have a regulatory scheme that we can live with than be in a position where we kind of have sort of a Wild West where people are doing whatever they want and saying we're entitled to do it because you didn't go through the proper process by getting approved by coastal. And then the double whammy that goes along with that is that they then say we are a legal non-conforming use, and even after you adopt regulations, we can continue to do it.
I just don't see how that could happen, given the way, I mean, you already have regulations in place. People who have permits have been told that these are subject to, and my understanding is that there has been voiced by one of the council members that we don't have to go to coastal. Although we have contacted coastal, and coastal says you absolutely have to come to us for anything associated with this. So I'm really getting a lot of mixed messages, and it would be
I'm not advocating that position. I'm just telling you these are the legal arguments. You know, we're in an area where no one can tell you black and white what the answer is, and if anybody tells you they can, they're not being honest with you. There's a lot of uncertainty in this area. The city has historically taken a very strong position against short-term rentals being allowed by right. You know, that has been our position for over 20 years, that they are something different than a residential use, and that before we had any regulation, they were operating illegally. We kind of corralled that all together when we came up with our regulations, and at least had some regulation on it, which, again, we say that the people who are operating with the permits we have right now would be operating illegally, but for the fact the city council is willing to let them operate pursuant to those permits, which are subject to ultimate coastal commission approval and us having some sort of a more comprehensive scheme. But if I'm one of those people, in light of the Santa Barbara case, the argument that you could make is that, well, if the law is that I can use my house this way already without the city doing anything, I'm using my house in a lawful manner. And as long as I'm using my house in a lawful manner, if the city changes the rules later, the new rules don't apply to me. I'm what's known as a legal non-conforming use. So the concept of legal non-conforming use, I'm just give you an easier example. If you have property that's zoned residential, so you've got a house on it, right? The city comes along and it rezones the property to make it commercial. So you can no longer have houses on it. Now it's zoned for a convenience store or an office building or whatever. You're allowed to keep your house there as long as you want, because it's legal. It was legal at the time that you started making that use, and you're not forced to have to change the use to be the convenience center or the office building or whatever the new use is. You're legal non-conforming. So that's the same argument that someone would make, is that right now, under the city's zoning and under the city's local coastal program, if the law is that we're allowed to use our home as a short-term rental, if somebody comes along later and changes the rules, then we're still allowed to operate the way we've always operated without being subject to the new rules.
I would say the flip of that, and that is if someone is operating a short-term rental, they are in conflict with the zoning. And I know you're saying that California Coastal is saying that zoning cannot preempt the right to rent your house, but that may only be in the coastal zone. And again, I'm
That's true. That's true. We're only talking about the coastal zone. Outside
right.
the coastal zone, there's a different issue. Yeah.
Even when I read
Sorry, with
that,
respect, may I address you if I may?
yeah, we can.
Hi. So my name's Jeff Lerner. I live on Beach Road, and I joined this meeting rather late, and I'm not quite sure what the agenda is, and for that I apologize. I'm a retired attorney, and having said that, it's clear that there are many different ways to skin the cat in the sense of compliance. And what I mean by that is irrespective of what may be out there and what the law may hold, if indeed you purchased your property subject to certain contractual obligations and limitations, those still will remain. So, for example, if there's a regulation in place, as there is relative to short-term rentals, and you purchase your property with agreement with those regulations are part of what you undertook to comply with. So you cannot just circumvent that by disregarding it because of some other factor. So, and part of those regulations, certainly in our area, refer to quantity of people, quantity of traffic, and so on and so forth. There's what parties you may hold, what parties you may not hold, and so on. So, and also talks about, if you will, confiscation and of the permit and removal of the permit. So, for example, there are, and one of the issues that needs to be addressed are people renting out properties where they rent to more than the required amount, and in terms of our regulation, it's basically 2 per bedroom. And what some of them have done is converted a kitchen into a bedroom, converted a dining room into a bedroom, and suddenly they're saying we are now conforming because we have so many people. And no, that's not the case. So what the permits provide and what the limitations are under the city plans, if you will, as to how many bedrooms there are, that's a curtailing factor. Other instances where cities have helped and eradicate the problem, which is really a nuisance problem. It's not, as far as we're concerned, because we've been subject to this for so long, it's not really a question of are rentals good or bad. It's a question of the renters, how do they act whilst they're here? Do they fit in with the community or don't they? And when you have a 2-day rental, we classify them as weekend warriors. They come in, they party, they are non-compliant. And the owner, or some of the owners that have these properties, are only looking to it as to the dollar value in a short-term basis. So they will rent out a property for $5,000 for a week, which ultimately divided by 10 people works out minimally and becomes very, very cost effective. So many cities have in fact invoked a minimum, firstly, a quantity per home, minimum rental, so as to not deflate the market and value of the property, keep out, and excuse that I say it, the riffraff or the people that are here paying $200 or $300 for a $5 million property for a couple of days and what have you. And the other criteria is the lack of direct control that is invoked by the owner over the renters, that the owners should be, and in fact, part of the regulations, are held accountable for the consequences of the renters. But the overall problem is we have no teeth. Much of the enforcement falls by the wayside because of the inability, whether it be lack of money, lack of resources in personnel or otherwise, to properly enforce it. The biggest criteria is, I'm unfortunately a member of CERT, which is the Citizens Emergency Response Team. In our area, Beach Road, we only have one exit, as it were. If, God forbid, there was a train derailment, or if there's a tsunami, or if there is some other calamity that befaces us, the real problem is how we then properly save lives, and at what cost. So the more we inundate with fictitious rentals or excessive bedrooms or permit rentals that ought not to be permitted, the more we place ourselves in jeopardy. And that's irrespective of what it does to the overall value of our properties. Notwithstanding all of that, as an owner, and having had a couple of renters on each side of us for a number of years, the biggest problem overall, if this could be, is the policing. If there was a way to properly police a renter, there's no difference overall between a renter and an occupant and an owner, if they behave themselves and if they conform. So it's all in a name, but it's how it's viewed and how it's enforced that I think is really, with respect, the trick behind it, or the way to wrestle the problem to the ground. Anyway, thank you very much for allowing me to talk. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. We've gone over our time. I really appreciate everybody's feedback today. A lot of really good comments, comments we haven't heard yet, and some thoughts and ideas that we can add to our list of things to continue to discuss. I want to encourage everybody today to continue to stay engaged, get more engaged, invite your neighbors to participate. There'll be many more meetings and more community outreach, and we really appreciate your time and hope to see you very soon as we continue these dialogues. And hope you guys all have a nice night.
Thank you.